Okay. It's only been a couple hours later. It's like 12:50, same day we had class. Might remember this shirt I was wearing. So I'm going to finish off the Bergson. This will be good for me since I know exactly kind of where we left off. And one of the things I was going to start talking about, and I have several more quotes that I want to talk about. And one thing I want to let you know, I'm going to put, if it's not already there, question and answer um, post at Canvas. So if anyone has any questions about Bergson or any other passages you were unclear, I'll definitely read them and reply to them when I can. Um, the two schools of thought that Bergson kind of has in his sights as he's going through his introduction to metaphysics are empiricism and rationalism. So, kind of, as you've probably been exposed to this over other courses, empiricists are like people like Hume, John Locke, and others, where basically the idea is that we have independent, distinct experiences coming in, and those distinct experiences kind of add up over time through memory, association of ideas, and various other sort of cognitive processes. It becomes our knowledge. So all our knowledge is kind of constructed out of distinct, conscious, empirical, hence empiricism, conscious empirical data, given stuff that's given to our senses primarily. Um, we'll see some of the phenomenologists very much criticizing sort of empiricism, as is Bergson. So there's going to be a sense in which they follow that. Russell was an empiricist in that respect. He believed in a plurality of distinct givens, sense data givens, and there are real relationships that we construct between those givens, greater than and equal to, for instance, as we looked at. Coffee, needing some coffee. And so that's empiricism. The other sort of school of thought that is often used in intellectual histories is rationalism. And rationalism is basically the notion that the mind, through its concepts and ideas, can grasp and understand the nature of reality, right? So it's the mind itself, through its rational understanding of things, that can understand the framework within which experience occurs. Um, so rationalism can become idealism. Hegel, for instance, would be a good example of a rationalist who became an idealist. In fact, one of the famous lines of Hegel that you might know is that the real is rational and the rational is real. So there's this kind of equation of reality with the rational. So that's kind of the other sort of camp. So there's this kind of unity of rational ideas within which experiences occur. Plato is often seen as a precursor to rationalism, and Aristotle is often seen as a precursor to empiricism. Not an not completely accurate analogy, but you kind of get the idea, right? Plato's more focused on ideas, and the ideas have everything that the things that share in that idea would have in common. Aristotle is more attuned to sort of the nuances of experience, especially in his virtue ethics. But um, but in the modern era, the one that Bergson is responding to, he has the form of rationalism and empiricism that I was talking about. He has people like Hume as empiricist and Spinoza as a rationalist. So with that in mind, I want to go to page. You don't have this edition, but it's a paragraph. For me, it's page 18. It's a paragraph that begins, such is. So it says, such is, however, the undertaking of the philosophers who try to reconstruct personality with psychical states, whether they confine themselves to those states alone, or whether they add a kind of thread for the purpose of joining the states together. Both empiricists and rationalists are victims of the same fallacy. Both of them mistake partial notions for real parts, thus confusing the point of view of analysis and of intuition, of science and metaphysics. So if we think about the example of Daniel Day-Lewis, the actor, as he's attempting to become Lincoln, it's not like Daniel Day-Lewis was trying to put together a bunch of personality traits, psychical states, that would create the whole that is Lincoln. Uh, so what he's trying to do instead is kind of get in, literally into the role, right, inside the role, which would be the example of intuition for Bergson. And in doing that, then what naturally flows from that would be the reality as Lincoln lives that reality. Um, so that was sort of the first part. And then a couple pages later, when he goes on, he talks about Peter and Paul. I'll just read this long sort of paragraph. It says, to these detached it's page 21 for me. To these detached psychical states, to these shadows of the ego, the sum of which was, for the empiricists, the equivalent of the self, rationalism, in order to reconstitute personality, adds something still more unreal, the void in which these shadows move. A place for shadows, one might say. How could this form, which in truth is formless, serve to characterize a living, active, concrete personality, or to distinguish Peter from Paul? Is it astonishing that philosophers who have isolated this form of personality should, then, find it insufficient to characterize a definite person, and that they should be gradually led to make their empty ego a kind of bottomless receptacle which belongs no more to Peter than to Paul, and in which there is room, according to our preference, for entire humanity, for God, or for existence in general? I see in this matter only one difference between empiricism and rationalism. The former, empiricism, seeking the unity of the ego in the gaps, as it were, between the psychical states, is led to fill the gaps with other states, and so on, right? Empirical, more and more evidence. And so on indefinitely, so that the ego, compressed in a constantly narrowing interval, tends towards zero, as analysis is pushed farther and farther. So that's the kind of tendency that Bradley brought out when he was talking about Russell's approach, that you keep having to go on and on and on. Whilst rationalism, and I suppose you could put Bradley into the rationalism camp, and I think this is where we could probably begin to see a difference between Bergson and Bradley. Rationalism, making the ego the place where mental states are lodged, is confronted with an empty space with which we have no reason to limit here rather than there, which goes beyond each of the successive boundaries that we try to assign to it. So the idea here, and he comes up with which I'll talk about in just a second, a metaphor that becomes very famous for people who study and write about Bergson. But both rationalism and empiricism have in common are distinct unities. So for rationalism, it's an empty one form that all these psychical states kind of fall into. And for empiricists, it's a distinct number of psychical states. But Peter and Paul, if we're going to understand Peter and Paul, there is no empty form that is Peter. Peter is a living, breathing personality. And we can't abstract a form out of Peter or Paul to understand the difference between them, nor can any of however many psychical states or anecdotes we add up to identify Peter or Paul. Neither one of those two are going to be adequate to understanding the difference between Peter and Paul. So we will see and recognize that Peter and Paul are different, and we will use through analysis and through things that are helpful in daily life, symbols and descriptions and so on to characterize the difference between the two. But there is something unique about each of them that is not captured by those words. It's neither the form, as the rationalist would have it, nor is it some collection of psychical states or empirical data either. It's the reality underneath, which leads Bergson to claim that to really understand a thing, we need to kind of get inside the thing, which is a strange idea when you first read it. And he calls that true empiricism. So he'll do that on the next page after the one I was reading at least. I'll just start with the paragraph that says the distance then between a so-called empiricism like that of Taine and the most transcendental speculations of certain German pantheists, like Hegel, I think he has in mind, is very much less, or maybe Schelling, probably Schelling, is very much less than is generally supposed. The method is analogous in both cases. It consists in reasoning about the elements of a translation as if they were parts of the original. But a true empiricism is that which proposes to get as near to the original itself as possible, to search deeply into its life, and so by a kind of intellectual auscultation, to feel the throbbings of its soul. And this true empiricism is the true metaphysics. So this gets back to the other concept that I mentioned in class earlier today, élan vital. And La Durée and élan vital are kind of complementary concepts. Élan vital is the life of things. It's the life of all reality, but it can't be, it's inexpressible. It can't be simply summarized by symbols or terms or concepts, nor is it a whole or a totality that can be summarized, that it contains it, because it's constantly changing, constantly evolving, constantly transforming itself. So there's no whole that can contain it either. And so he comes up then after this passage on the next page, and I won't read it because I can just describe it. He comes up with this concept of multiplicity. And multiplicity is a concept that is used in contrast with the one, which would be the rationalist approach, or the multiple, which would be the empiricist approach. And we could kind of see Bergson is sort of using this concept of multiplicity to kind of steer a course between both Bradley, who you could see there's the one reality, the one single experience for reality for Bradley, and the multiple, the diversity that Russell supports. So multiplicity is neither one nor multiple. What is it? So he gives this metaphor of a cone. So I don't have a drawing here, but often in many of Matter and Memory is one of Bergson's famous books where he will have diagrams of cones. But imagine a cone starting at a point, and imagine one of those like Dixie cups, cone cups that you get like a water jug and you put it on to get a little bit of water. So like that kind of a cone, or an ice cream cone. So it starts off at a point, but then a circle, from that point, a circle kind of emerges and kind of expands, so the cone gets bigger and bigger as it goes out. So the multiplicity is neither the point that is the point of the cone, nor is it the circle. It is the movement of the process between the point and the circle. So if we think of like logic and sort of categorical syllogisms and categorical logic, very often it's described in, they use Venn diagrams, for instance. I think if you were in the logic class with me or other logic classes, you probably did Venn diagrams. And so if we say all banks are financial institutions, we would have a big circle for financial institutions, and everything within that circle is a financial institution. And everything outside that circle is not a financial institution. But what have we said? We've said all banks are financial institutions. So now we have a circle within that bigger circle, and everything within that circle is a bank, and outside that circle are non-banks. So by looking at the circle, we can see everything that's in the bank circle is also in the financial institutions circle. So we can say all banks are institutions. So that's the way that kind of Venn diagram pictures those types of claims. But what's going on here is you've got this relationship between a circle that's a container, a form, within which you put all these entities, elements that belong in that circle. that have that category applying to it. What Bergson is saying is that multiplicity is neither a circle like that, nor is it a point or element. It's a multiplicity. So a multiplicity is a kind of process from which these ones and multiples arise as a form of abstraction that happens as living beings like us need to get around and make sense of their lives in the world. So ones and multiples, like sort of the representations and symbols, concepts and categories, they emerge as we become focused on the needs of life. And they're basically tools. The mistake is to confuse the tools we need for purposes of life with reality. Reality as multiplicity makes tools and the use of these tools possible, but it is not to be confused with those tools. One thing, metaphor that you can say is that it's kind of like pointing to the moon. If you're pointing using your hand and fingers to point something, the pointing is a means for something, to try to understand things and to indicate things and to get along and do things, etc. But the mistake is to think that the pointing is the reality. The pointing is pointing to a reality, but not the reality. And so he'll say something along these lines. Let's see here. First thing I want to read is it. So this is kind of where we get to where what philosophy is again, or metaphysics is for Bergson. So for me, it's 25, 26. So he says, either there is no philosophy possible, and all knowledge of things is a practical knowledge, aimed at the profit to be drawn from them. So in other words, practical knowledge, what I was just saying, that we have these concepts and tools and science, etc., as a way of making our controlling things in the world. Basically, it's control. And or, he goes on, or else philosophy consists in placing oneself within the object itself by an effort of intuition. And so the true empiricism that I talked about before. So that would be metaphysics. That would be the true philosophy. That kind of study of things by representations and concepts and science, as handy as it is, doesn't get at the reality of things. In fact, that was the debate that Bergson and Einstein had when Einstein was writing about time in his theory of relativity, how time is relative to speed. So I don't know if anyone watched the movie Interstellar. There's a scene towards the end where he goes into a black hole and time gets warped through this going through a black hole, and then he comes out and he's still pretty much the same age, but his daughter is now like 50, 60 years older. So all this sort of time change. And basically, you can kind of understand what Bergson's going to be saying here. He's going to say that you have a scientific representation of time, which is distinct from the durée, the experience of time as multiplicity, as a kind of unfolding, inexpressible reality that can't be reduced to a kind of equation of physics. So as you might imagine, Einstein didn't agree. So they kind of ended up agreeing to disagree. And there hasn't been a lot made of that distinction or that debate, probably because Einstein has such credibility as a scientist. It's kind of like they're talking about apples and oranges. And I think we live in a society, because of our practical needs and concerns, that puts a lot of emphasis on science and the practical knowledge that science gives us. So most people have tended to ignore the concerns or the criticisms that Bergson put against Einstein's understanding of time. For those who are also interested, another book that Bergson wrote is Time and Free Will. So he obviously time was an important issue for him. Um, let's see here. One other point here. Okay, so for me, this is page 29. It's a paragraph that begins, consider, for example. This is just one more example of the sort of abstract, homogeneous space within which things occur. So now we have a better understanding of this, that in some ways both rationalists and empiricists are kind of flip sides of the same uh, um, tendency we have in practical knowledge and reducing knowledge to kind of a practical concern. So abstracting kind of a form or a circle or a concept or a space within which things can be measured, that's kind of a rational approach. And then the measurements themselves, distinguishing things, plotting relations between the elements, etc., that's more the empiricist. So both are kind of two sides of the same coin for Bergson. To go back to the cone metaphor, they're both part of the same process. One part at one end is the point, which is the empiricist looking at the data, and then the other is the whole that contains it all, the circle part of the cone. That would be the rationalist. Um, so, with that in mind, he says, consider, for example, the variability which is nearest to homogeneity, that of movement in space. Along the whole of this movement, we can imagine possible stopping points. These are what we call the positions of the moving body, or the points by which it passes. So, for instance, and this is a point that Russell brings up in his essay that I mentioned in class, that when he writes a critical essay of Bergson, when a arrow is shot, the arrow goes through space, and we can imagine it passing through points of that space, right? So at each point, and we could measure, right? It got to that point, and we can even imagine a rapid video that kind of with a kind of ruler on the background, and we can see exactly when the arrow passes each point, and we could even have a clock underneath going down to the thousandths of a second. And we can say at this thousandth of a second it was here. So you see how we can measure all these things, and we do that, and we can do it in a very sophisticated way now. And Russell's all in favor of that, right? Russell's in favor of these distinct things upon which we can establish relationships between these things and so on. But Russell's going to say that again, that's all analysis, right? That's all analysis. But with these positions of the arrow going through space with time measurements and ruler measurements on the wall behind, etc. But with these positions, even with an infinite number of them, we shall never make movement. They are not parts of the movement, they are so many snapshots of it. They are, one might say, only supposed stopping places. The moving body is never really in any of the points. The most we can say is that it passes through them. So there's two ways of thinking about movement. There's the practical way of thinking about movement, kind of the way of science and everyday life, and movement is the movement from one point to another. Right? We'll even say, as long as the car gets me from A to B, I'm fine with it. Right? So we think of movement as a movement between points. We talked about that in class today too, the starting and stopping points and so on. But what he has in mind is a pure mobility, that a pure movement that is not ever at any point, right? So it's like a continuum that is never a point, right? And that's in the same way that the cone as a process is never the point at the bottom of the cone, nor is it the circle at the top. It's just a process of continuous evolution, creation, rolling and unrolling that we talked about in class today. Okay. At this point, we'd probably be having some questions asked. So a couple pages later, and we talked about this in class today, that it's hard to make sense of movement that isn't occurring in space, right? A movement that we can measure, because that's just how we tend to think of movement, as something that is a measurable phenomena of one body moving from one place and location to another place and location. And Bergson recognizes that. So a couple pages later, there's a paragraph that begins, but the symbol in this case responds to the most inveterate habits of our thought. We place ourselves as a rule in immobility, in which we find a point of support for practical purposes. And with this immobility, we try to reconstruct motion. We only obtain in this way a clumsy imitation, a counterfeit of real movement, but this imitation is much more useful in life than the intuition of the thing itself would be. Now, our mind has an irresistible tendency to consider that idea clearest, which is most often useful to it. That is why immobility seems to it clearer than mobility, and rest anterior to movement. So in life and the practical needs of life, we need to have certain sort of divide things up into starting and stopping points. So movement needs to be thought of from the perspective of practical concerns, scientific concerns, as movement from point A to point B, from one immobility to another, right? Point A is just a starting point. It's an immobile point. B is a ending point, an immobile point. And movement is just the process of going from one immobility to another. So what are we doing there? We're making the immobile primary. But we can never really understand movement if we think of it only as the movement between two immobile points. I mean, that's Bergson's point. And he's like, that's hard to make sense of. And the reason it's hard to make sense of for Bergson is because we are always thinking out of our habits and practical needs in terms of immobility. But if we do metaphysics and philosophy, we might get to the point where we recognize the pure mobility that actually made these immobilities possible through abstraction. But these abstractions can never recreate or reconstitute the pure motion and mobility that made them possible. So that's a key point, and that's, I think, probably one of the key points of Bergson, that he has been repeating it a few times. And I think I'm doing pretty good with covering a lot of the stuff that I want to cover. So the last several pages of Introduction to Metaphysics, he ends with 8 points. So for me, it begins on page 38. But each point is given a Roman numeral. So I'm going to go through each of these, because after kind of going through these themes again and kind of just kind of repeating that point about pure motion or la durée, and sort of, I don't know, chronological time, the time of between immobile points, he kind of summarizes the implications of all this for philosophy or for his philosophy, and he does so in 8 points. So I'm not going to read the entirety of each of these points, but I'm just going to kind of summarize real quickly each of the 8, and that'll pretty much be it for Bergson. But some of these themes, some of these ideas will come back with later philosophers as we talk about them, just as we can kind of see echoes of Bradley and Russell kind of in these ideas that Bergson is doing. So where we are after finishing Bergson today is we're with kind of 4 of the key philosophers that have really kind of, I don't know, set the stage for a lot of the philosophy that occurs in the 20th century on up to today, really, in some sense. And that is Bradley and Russell and Nietzsche and Bergson. So anyways, okay, at 38, the first point is the shortest and quickest of all. He says, there is a reality that is external and yet given immediately to the mind. Common sense is right on this point, as against the idealism and realism of the philosophers. So, in contrast to someone who might say, that seems like a strange philosophy. Um, he's like, well, what he's basically saying is that we are immediately aware of and experience an objective external reality. Okay. Uh, what the problem is that as we then try to name and characterize and conceptualize this reality, that's where we tend to go astray, right? We tend to say, as I did with the song by the band Squid, right? If you were like never heard the song or the album, and I tried to describe it with words and so on, you just wouldn't. You might get some idea based on your own experiences, but um, for um, Bergson, however, we all are given a reality that is external and, as he puts it, immediately given to the mind. That is la durée. That's what's immediately given to the mind as a continuously unfolding duration or time. And that brings us to point two. This reality is mobility, not things made, but things in the making, not self maintaining states, but only changing states exist. So, again, in the kind of philosophical tradition, if we have this sort of contrast between being and becoming, Bergson falls into the category of there's just being, I mean, not being, becoming, changing states. And the static states are abstractions that we make in our lives as a sort of practical necessity in order to make do and to live and control aspects of our experience. But the reality itself, that is immediately given in our experience, is pure changing, or as he puts it, mobility. So that was point two. So onto the third of eight. Our mind, which seeks for solid points of support, has for its main function in the ordinary course of life that of representing states and things. It takes at long intervals almost instantaneous views of the undivided mobility of the real. It thus obtains sensations and ideas. So basically, what our mind does is it divides up this undivided reality and gives us ideas and sensations and representations that we then use as a way of making sense of our experience, controlling things, expressing our desires to one another through language. All these phenomena are basically what is made possible by our mind. But our mind is part of a living being that is in a world that's changing, and the reality underneath it as mobility is not completely captured by these representations or what the mind does. It's like, again, the trip to Paris. All of these photos that you might take do not give the person who's not been to Paris the experience of having been to Paris. Okay. Number four, he says, I'm not reading the entirety of these points, but the rest of the paragraphs for each of them, he just kind of goes into more detail to talk about some of the things that I was talking about. Number four, the inherent difficulties of metaphysics, the antinomies which it gives rise to, and the contradictions into which it falls, the division into antagonistic schools, and the irreducible opposition between systems, are largely the result of our applying to the disinterested knowledge of the real processes which we generally employ for practical ends. So the contrast between empiricism and rationalism that I started with today is a result of contrasting the circle on the one hand with the point on the other, right? Rational unity on the one hand, practical and analytical distinctions and divisions on the other. All those distinctions and the role they play are important and helpful in practical life, but they are not, again, expressions of reality, right? So the antinomies and a lot of the problems that metaphysicians, or you'll see the antinomies in Kant. In Kant's Critique of Pure Reason, he has a whole section of antinomies, and the argument here is basically that for Bergson, is that those antinomies are a result of conceptual abstraction, that they aren't there in reality intrinsically. So it's similar to what Kant would say. Kant would also say that the antinomies aren't there, but the way of getting rid of the antinomies for Kant is to claim that there is no ultimate reality behind the antinomies, right? That's are not behind the representations. There's just representations. Whereas what Bergson is saying is that we get rid of the antinomies if we get beyond the need to represent reality. It's only when we attempt to represent reality that we end up with the antinomies. So that was point 4. Point 5, and here it's kind of appropriate that I was referring to Kant, because point 5 very much, I think, has Kant in mind, because he says, after talking about concepts as a way of making sense of our experience, he says, in this, it was bound to fail. By that I mean trying to fix reality, completely explain reality by way of concepts. It is on this impotence, and on this impotence only, that the skeptical, idealist, critical doctrines really dwell. In fact, all doctrines that deny to our intelligence the power of attaining the absolute. So again, Kant would certainly deny to us the power of attaining the absolute. We are basically kind of, all knowledge we have is discursive, is basically through representations. We cannot know the noumenal reality. Whereas Bergson is claiming that we already have reality immediately to mind. It's only when we use representations that we then get into the antinomies and the problems. So that's kind of where we have this break with Kant. And part of one of the concepts that I've talked about today that was important to that process was that concept of multiplicity. Because multiplicity is neither one, a point, nor is it a circle, a unity that would contain an infinite number of points. Okay. That was number 5. Number 6, the truth is that our intelligence can follow the opposite method. It can place itself within the mobile reality and adopt its ceaselessly changing direction. In short, can grasp by means of that intellectual sympathy which we call intuition. So again, here he's saying that we don't have to follow the path of representation and analysis. We can follow the path of intuition. Okay. How we do that we would have to talk about Bergson a lot more and go into a lot of the other details about that. But we've kind of gotten a sense of it, and I think one of the answers to that question is phenomenology. Phenomenology would be one of the ways in which you try to tap into the experience of the unfolding consciousness. So that was, what was that? That was 6. 2 more, and we're almost done. 7, this inversion. So this is the inversion that goes from experience of mobility to the analysis that looks at immobilities. The inversion is going from immobilities, kind of things being separated in an empirical, practical way, going the inverse route to intuition. So 70 says, this inversion has never been practiced in a methodical manner, but a profoundly considered history of human thought would show that we owe to it all that is great in the sciences, as well as all that is permanent in metaphysics. The most powerful of the methods of investigation at the disposal of the human mind, the infinitesimal calculus, originated from this very inversion. Modern mathematics is precisely an effort to substitute the being made for the ready-made, to follow the generation of magnitudes, to grasp motion no longer from without and in its displayed result, but from within and in its tendency to change. So if we think about calculus, one of what he has in mind here is that calculus was no longer a description of states, but attempted to describe or represent spontaneous change, instantaneous change. So, and that's one of the reasons that calculus became such an important tool of modern science, because it helped us to better represent a changing reality. Now, again, although it helps us to better represent a changing reality, again, we want to be careful not to confuse the representations of infinitesimal calculus with the pure mobility that um, uh, Bergson's talking about. But the infinitesimal calculus was made possible by this kind of pure mobility, and we can see the sort of advances that are made by infinitesimal calculus as a result of that. So I think that's an example that he's bringing up to show how we have made these sort of inverse moves in the past. And last but not least, number 8. I'll just read this paragraph. I'll just read these 2 paragraphs because that'll kind of bring us to the end for today. The reason why this object has been lost sight of and why science itself has been mistaken in the origin of the processes it employs is that intuition, once attained, must find a mode of expression and of application which conforms to the habits of our thought, and one which furnishes us, in the shape of well-defined concepts, with the solid points of support which we so greatly need. In that lies the condition of what we call exactitude and precision, and also the condition of the unlimited extension of a general method to particular cases. Now, this extension and this work of logical improvement can be continued for centuries, whilst the act which creates the method lasts but for a moment. That is why we so often take the logical equipment of science for science itself, forgetting the metaphysical intuition from which all the rest has sprung. From the overlooking of this intuition proceeds all that has been said by philosophers and by men of science themselves about the relativity of scientific knowledge. What is relative is the symbolic knowledge by pre-existing concepts, which proceeds from the fixed to the moving, and not the intuitive knowledge, which installs itself in that which is moving and adopts the very life of things. This intuition attains the absolute. And that's metaphysics, according to Bergson. So hopefully I've talked about enough examples and sort of the contrast between the limitations of representational knowledge and the advantages of a sort of inkling in a movement towards pure mobility, and how that can change things. It made changes to mathematics, the advent of calculus, and likely will make changes going forward as people take that inverse path and come up with other ways of describing the reality that's right there before us. That is, and it may become a science and be called a science, but it was made possible by a reality, the reality that is pure mobility. And if we think of metaphysics as the study of reality, then we can see how, for Bergson, metaphysics is what makes science itself and everything else possible, at least philosophically. So I think that's it for Bergson. So again, if anyone has any questions, feel free to kind of post them up on that sort of discussion board that I'll place up on Canvas. Or we can begin class on the 17th when I get back with some discussion about Bergson. But otherwise, that's it. I'll see you all when I get back. Take care.